They said defying the council was political suicide. 3 days after Alpha King Paul publicly chose Sarah over centuries of tradition, the Stone Wolf Dominion held its breath, waiting to see if their king would survive his own rebellion. Sarah stood at the tower window, watching dawn bleed across a kingdom that now knew her name. Not as the invisible archivist who catalogued their histories, but as the Omega, the Alpha King had refused to surrender. The woman he'd killed for. The one he'd chosen over the crown itself. Visibility, she'd discovered, was its own kind of violence. "You haven't slept," Paul said from behind her. Sarah didn't turn. She'd felt him wake moments ago through the bond that wasn't quite. That golden thread connecting them, still incomplete, but growing stronger each day. "Neither have you." "I'm used to it." "That's not the comfort you think it is." She heard him move closer, felt the heat of him at her back. He didn't touch her. He'd been careful about that since the confrontation, as if afraid one wrong move would shatter whatever fragile thing existed between them. "The Northern Pax sent messengers," Paul said quietly. "They want assurance that my decision hasn't compromised my judgment." "Your decision?" Sarah finally turned to face him. "Is that what I am now?" Paul's silver eyes met hers, exhaustion carving lines around them that hadn't been there a week ago. "You're the reason half my allies are questioning my stability, and the other half are waiting to see if I'll back down." He paused. "You're also the only reason I'm still standing." The honesty of it struck her breathless. Paul looked different in the morning light, less like the controlled Alpha King and more like a man who'd gambled everything on a single hand, and was only now realizing what he'd risked. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "Every moment?" His lips curved into something too broken to be called a smile. "And not at all." A knock interrupted them. Commander Hayes entered without waiting for permission, his scarred face grim. "The council has called an emergency session. They're demanding your presence within the hour." "Let them demand." "Your Majesty." Hayes glanced at Sarah, something almost like sympathy flickering across his expression. "They're calling it a trial. Your fitness to rule is being formally questioned." The words settled like stones in Sarah's stomach. This was what she'd feared. Not the assassination attempts or the political maneuvering, but this, becoming the weapon the council used to destroy Paul. "Then I'll answer their questions," Paul said coldly. "They're using the Omega Protection Act, claiming you're under undue influence." Hayes's jaw tightened. "That the bond has compromised your ability to make rational decisions. We're not bonded." "They don't believe that. Not after you publicly claimed her. Not after you killed 3 of their execution squad to protect her." Sarah watched Paul process this, saw the moment he understood the trap. If he denied the bond, he proved it was just irrational obsession. If he confirmed it, he'd broken council law by bonding without approval. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now back to the story. Either way, they had him. "What happens if they find him unfit?" Sarah asked quietly. Hayes looked at her directly for the first time. "They force abdication, or they remove him by force." The room went still. Paul moved to his desk, began pulling on his formal armor with mechanical precision. "Then I'll make them try." "Paul," Sarah crossed to him, catching his wrist. "You can't fight the entire council. Watch me. This is exactly what they want, for you to prove you're unstable, dangerous." Her grip tightened. "They're baiting you into becoming the monster they've always claimed unbonded kings become." Paul's eyes blazed gold for just a moment, his wolf rising at the challenge. Then, slowly, the color faded back to silver. He looked down at where Sarah held his wrist. at her small hand wrapped around his armored forearm. "I don't know how to love without breaking things," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear. "Every instinct I have screams to tear the council apart for threatening you, to make them afraid to even speak your name." He met her eyes. "Tell me how to be what you need without becoming what they fear." The vulnerability in those words cracked something open in Sarah's chest. This was the truth beneath the restraint, not control born from discipline, but from terror. Terror of his own capacity for violence. Terror of becoming the very thing that would destroy what he was trying to protect. "You be exactly what you are," Sarah said firmly. "A king who chooses truth over convenience, who protects without possessing, who's strong enough to face judgment without losing himself." She released his wrist. "And you let me stand beside you when you do it." "Sarah." "I'm done hiding," she said. "If they're going to judge you for choosing me, then they can judge us both." Paul stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. As they prepared to face the council's judgment, Sarah understood one terrible truth. Her fantasy of being chosen had come true. Now she had to help Paul survive the consequences. The council chamber felt like a tomb. Sarah stood in the gallery, no longer hidden, but deliberately positioned where every council member could see her. Paul had insisted. If they were going to use her as evidence of his instability, she would face them directly. Below, the remaining council members sat in a semicircle around Paul's chair, deliberately arranged to make him feel surrounded. Councillor Perth led the proceedings, his thin face pinched with barely concealed satisfaction. "Alpha King Paul," Perth began, his voice echoing off stone walls. "You stand accused of judgment compromised by inappropriate attachment, of placing personal desire above the Dominion's stability, of bonding without council approval in direct violation of the mate accords." "I've bonded no one," Paul said coldly. "Yet you publicly claimed the Omega archivist, relocated her to your private chambers, killed members of the Royal Guard." "Killed assassins sent by members of this council to execute an innocent woman," Paul interrupted. "Let's be accurate about what we're discussing." Perth's jaw tightened. "Lady Vex and her co-conspirators have been dealt with, but their concerns about your attachment remain valid. An unbonded king is vulnerable to manipulation. The Omega may not have poisoned you, but her influence is equally dangerous." Sarah's hands clenched on the gallery railing. They were doing exactly what Paul had predicted, twisting protection into obsession, choice into weakness. "State your terms," Paul said flatly. "The council offers two paths forward." Perth gestured to a parchment before him. "First, you agree to take a politically approved mate from our revised list. The Omega will be relocated to a distant pack with generous compensation. Your relationship ends, your judgment is restored, and the matter is closed. And the second option, you step down as Alpha King, abdicate in favor of your cousin Marcus, who has agreed to uphold traditional mate selection protocols." Perth's eyes gleamed. "You may keep your Omega, but you lose your crown." The ultimatum hung in the air like poison. Sarah's breath caught. They were forcing him to choose, her or the kingdom. The exact trap she'd feared since the moment he'd first said her name. "There is a third option," Lady Marrow said quietly from her seat. The elderly councillor had remained loyal throughout the conspiracy, and her voice carried weight. "Ancient law, rarely invoked, the trial of true bond." Perth's expression soured. "That law is archaic, but still valid." Lady Marrow met Paul's gaze. "If a king claims a bond formed without council approval, he may prove its authenticity through the trial. If the bond is proven true, formed by genuine mate recognition rather than mere desire, the council must accept it." "And if it's not proven," Paul asked, then you're deemed unfit to rule. Immediate abdication. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. They weren't bonded, not fully. The connection between them was real, growing stronger every day, but it hadn't snapped into place. They hadn't completed the mating that would seal it permanently. How could they prove something that didn't technically exist yet? The trial hasn't been invoked in over a century, Perth protested. For good reason. It's barbaric. It's law, Lady Marrow said firmly. And it offers the only path where the king keeps both his mate and his crown, if the bond is genuine. Paul's eyes found Sarah's across the chamber. She saw the question in them, the fear. They both knew the truth. What existed between them was real, but incomplete, untested, born from choice rather than the mystical mate recognition the old laws described. How long do I have to decide? Paul asked, his gaze still locked on Sarah's. 3 days, Perth said, after which we vote on forced abdication. The session ended with formal dismissal, council members filing out in clusters of whispered conversation. Sarah remained frozen in the gallery until the chamber emptied, until only Paul remained below, staring at the chair that might soon belong to someone else. She descended the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a choice. "They're going to force the bond," she said when she reached him. "Make us prove something that should be private. Or they'll take the crown." Paul's voice was hollow. "Everything I've built. Every reform I've fought for, gone. Then we refuse both options. Find another way." "There is no other way." He finally looked at her, and Sarah saw the truth written in his silver eyes. The only path forward required them to complete the bond they'd been carefully, cautiously building. And they had 3 days to decide if they were ready to make that choice, or lose everything. Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in the guest chamber Paul had given her, separate from his rooms, separate from everything, because even now he was careful about her choice, and stared at the ceiling as moonlight painted shadows across stone. 3 days. 3 days to complete a bond that should unfold naturally, slowly, when they were both ready. 3 days to prove something intimate and sacred to a council that saw it as political leverage. 3 days to choose between Paul's crown and their autonomy. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years fantasizing about being chosen. Now that choice was being used as a weapon against them both. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she said, already knowing who it was. The bond that wasn't hummed between them, pulling like a tide. Paul entered quietly, still dressed despite the late hour. He looked exhausted, not physically, but in that deeper way that came from carrying impossible decisions. "I can't ask this of you," he said without preamble. "The bond, the trial, any of it." Sarah sat up. "You're not asking. The council is." "Then I'm telling you, we refuse." Paul moved to the window, his back to her. "I'll abdicate. Marcus can have the crown. We'll leave the Dominion. Start somewhere new where..." "Where what?" "Where you pretend you don't belong here." Sarah stood, crossing to him. "Where you abandon everything you've built, because the council is weaponizing our relationship. Better than forcing you into a bond you're not ready for." "What makes you think I'm not ready?" Paul turned sharply. "Because I'm not." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. "The bond is permanent, Sarah. Irrevocable." His jaw tightened. "Once it snaps into place, there's no going back. My instincts, my wolf, my every possessive impulse, all of it amplified, unbreakable. And I don't." He stopped, breathing hard. "I don't know if I can be what you need once that happens." Sarah understood suddenly. This wasn't about the council or the trial, or even the crown. This was about Paul's deepest fear, that the bond would transform him into the kind of alpha who claimed rather than chose, who possessed rather than partnered. "What do you think will happen?" she asked gently. "I think I'll stop being able to give you space. Stop being able to let you choose freely. I think the bond will make me—" He stopped again, struggling. Mating bonds make alphas territorial, possessive. Everything I've spent 12 years controlling. Or, Sarah said carefully, it will make you feel safe enough to finally stop controlling so hard. Paul's eyes snapped to hers. "You think the bond will make you a monster," Sarah continued, moving closer. "I think you're afraid it will prove you've always been human. That restraint isn't what makes you good. Choice is. And the bond won't change that. You can't know that." "You're right. I can't." She stopped just in front of him. "But I know you asked permission before touching me in the archives. I know you pulled your wolf back after killing to protect me. I know you've given me 17 chances to see your humanity before I ever saw your crown." Paul's hands clenched at his sides. "What if I lose that? What if the bond makes me forget how to ask?" "Then I'll remind you." Sarah reached up slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and placed her hand over his heart. "That's what the bond is supposed to do, isn't it? Make us stronger, together than we are alone. The council will make us perform it like a spectacle, prove it's real, submit to their judgment. I don't care about the council." The words came out fiercer than Sarah intended. "I care that you're standing here, terrified of becoming something you could never be. I care that we're letting them turn something sacred into a political weapon." Paul covered her hand with his, pressing it more firmly against his chest. "Tell me the truth. If we had all the time in the world, if there was no council, no trial, no ultimatum, would you choose this? Choose me?" Sarah met his silver gaze without hesitation. "I chose you the moment I locked that archive door. Every choice since has just been following through." Something shifted in Paul's expression. Not quite relief, but the beginning of it. "Then we do it our way," he said quietly. "Not on the council's timeline, not to prove anything to them, but because we're ready, because we choose to. And if that means losing the crown—" Paul's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Then I finally learn what I've always been too afraid to discover, that some things matter more than power." Outside, the moon hung heavy over a kingdom holding its breath. Inside, two people finally stopped running from the bond they'd been building all along. They had 3 days, and for the first time, Sarah believed they might actually be enough. The attack came at dawn on the second day. Sarah woke to alarm bells and the thunder of boots on stone. Not the organized rhythm of guard rotations, but the chaos of genuine crisis. She was already reaching for clothes when Paul burst through her door, Commander Hayes at his heels. "Get dressed, quickly." Paul's voice was clipped, controlled, but Sarah felt his wolf pressing close to the surface through their incomplete bond. "We're moving you to the inner vault." "What's happening?" "Alpha Damien of the Blackridge Pack has crossed our borders with 300 warriors." Hayes was checking weapons with practiced efficiency. "He's demanding an audience with the king. Says he has terms." Sarah's blood went cold. Terms for what? Paul and Hayes exchanged a look, the kind of weighted silence that spoke louder than words. "For you," Paul said finally. "He's offering protection. Claims the council has proven incapable of managing the Omega question, and he's willing to take responsibility for your situation." The careful phrasing didn't hide the truth. Alpha Damien wasn't offering protection. He was offering to claim her himself, removing Paul's distraction and positioning himself as the rational alternative to an unstable king. "That's convenient timing," Sarah said, her mind already racing. 2 days before the trial of True Bond. Almost like someone told him exactly when to strike. Perth. Hayes spat the name like a curse. Had to be. He's been conspiring with Blackridge for months. We found correspondence in Lady Vex's quarters, but couldn't prove Perth's involvement. Now we can." Paul's jaw was set, his eyes flickering between silver and gold. Damien wouldn't risk an incursion without council backing. Perth must have promised him something, territory, trade rights, or... "Me," Sarah finished. "He promised I'd be available once you were forced to abdicate." The room went silent. Paul's control cracked visibly, his hands clenching, shoulders tensing, that dangerous stillness that preceded violence. "I will burn Blackridge to ash before I let him touch you." "Your Majesty," Hayes said carefully. "That's exactly the response they're counting on. If you march out to meet Damien while emotionally compromised, they'll use it as proof of instability. The council will vote for forced abdication before sunset." "Then what would you have me do? Hide while a rival pack invades my borders and demands my—" Paul stopped himself, breathing hard. "Your what?" Sarah asked quietly. Paul's eyes met hers, and she saw the word he couldn't say. "Mine." The possessive claim that terrified him, the instinct he'd spent 12 years suppressing. "The Omega under my protection," he said instead, the careful phrasing costing him visible effort. Sarah felt something shift inside her. Not fear, but clarity. She'd spent her entire life being careful. Being invisible, letting others decide her fate. The council wanted to use her as leverage. Damien saw her as a prize. Even Paul, despite his best intentions, was trying to protect her by hiding her away. None of them were asking what she wanted. "No," Sarah said firmly. Both men turned to stare at her. "No," Paul repeated. "I'm not hiding in a vault while you negotiate my future without me." Sarah crossed her arms, channeling every ounce of authority she'd learned from watching Paul command a kingdom. "I'm not a prize to be won, or a problem to be solved. I'm the person at the center of this conflict, and I deserve to face it directly. Sarah, if Damien gets his hands on you, then you stop him, but you don't do it by treating me like something fragile that needs to be locked away." She moved closer to Paul, feeling his wolf recognize hers even through the incomplete bond. "You said I was dangerous. You said I just didn't realize it yet. So stop protecting me from my own power, and let me use it." Paul stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that the Omega he'd been protecting had already transformed into something more. "What are you suggesting?" Hayes asked carefully. Sarah turned to him. "Damien wants an audience with the king. Fine, give him one, but make it public. Council present, witnesses everywhere. Let him state his terms in front of the entire Dominion." She looked back at Paul. "And let me be the one to refuse him." "That's incredibly dangerous," Hayes said. "So is hiding." Sarah's voice didn't waver. "They're using me to destabilize Paul's rule. So I'm going to be the one who proves he's not compromised, by standing beside him with my own voice, my own choice, my own power." Paul was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. Then, slowly, something like pride flickered across his expression. "You're not someone to protect from power anymore," he said quietly. "You're someone to protect with power." "Finally," Sarah said. "He understands." Outside, an enemy army waited at the gates, believing an Omega would be their path to victory. They were about to learn otherwise. The confrontation with Alpha Damien lasted less than an hour. Sarah had stood before the assembled court, council, guards, visiting dignitaries, and Damien himself, and spoken with a clarity that surprised even her. She refused his protection. She refused the council's interference. She stated, clearly and publicly, that she chose to stand beside Paul not because she was compelled, but because she wanted to. Damien had left empty-handed, his political maneuvering exposed for what it was. Perth had been formally charged with conspiracy. The council's power had fractured visibly, but the trial of True Bond still loomed. One day remained. Now, as night fell over the Stonewolf Dominion, Sarah stood in Paul's private chambers and finally understood what she wanted. "You don't have to do this tonight," Paul said quietly. He stood by the window, giving her space even now. "We have until tomorrow evening. We can wait." "I don't want to wait." Sarah's voice was steady. "Not because the council demands it. Not because we're running out of time. But because I'm ready, Paul. I've been ready since you asked me to stay that first night. Maybe even before that." Paul turned to face her, and she saw everything in his expression. Want and fear and desperate hope tangled together. "The bond is forever," he said, needing her to understand. "Once it snaps into place, we're connected, permanently. You'll feel everything I feel. My wolf, my instincts, your love." Sarah moved closer. "That's what you're afraid to say, isn't it? That the bond will prove what we've both been dancing around for weeks." Paul's breath caught. "I love you," Sarah said simply. "Not the Alpha King. Not the crown or the power or the fantasy I built in my head. You, the man who counted every time he spoke to me, who noticed when I tucked my hair behind my ear. Who's so terrified of becoming a monster that he's forgotten he's already chosen to be human." "Sarah, let me finish." She stopped directly in front of him. "You asked me what I want. I want to stop choosing you in secret. I want to feel you without barriers. I want the bond that terrifies you, because it's the one thing you can't control. And I want you to trust that it won't destroy the parts of you I love most." Paul's hands rose slowly, cupping her face with that devastating gentleness. "If the bond changes me, if I become possessive or demanding then I'll tell you, and you'll listen. Because that's who you are, Paul, with or without the bond." Sarah covered his hands with hers. "Stop being afraid of losing control. Start trusting that control was never what made you worth loving." Something in Paul broke. She felt it through the incomplete bond, felt the moment his last defense crumbled. He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing ragged. "I need you to say it," he whispered. "One more time. Clear and certain. Because once we do this, I won't be able to let you go." Sarah pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I choose you. I choose this bond. I choose us. Not because the council demands it, not to save your crown, but because I want to spend forever feeling this close to you. Are you sure, Paul?" She smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her then, gentle at first, questioning, giving her every chance to change her mind. Sarah kissed him back, pouring years of hidden wanting into the touch. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt the bond between them pull taut with anticipation. "How do we—" Sarah started. "Intent," Paul said quietly. "Choice. Both of us, willing. Both of us, ready." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "The bond recognizes truth." Sarah nodded. She placed her hand over his heart, felt it hammering beneath her palm. Paul's hand covered hers, then slid up to rest against her chest, mirroring the gesture. "Together?" she whispered. "Together." They both closed their eyes. Sarah felt her wolf rise to the surface, no longer suppressed, no longer afraid. Felt Paul's wolf meet hers with recognition and welcome. Felt the golden thread between them. That connection they'd been building since Blood in the Archives, since Firelight conversations, since every small moment of trust. And then, with devastating simplicity, the bond snapped into place. The sensation was overwhelming, not physical pleasure, though warmth flooded through her, but connection, belonging without ownership, his emotions bleeding into hers, love fierce and protective, fear finally releasing its hold, relief so profound it felt like coming home. And underneath it all, choice. Mutual and willing, and absolutely certain. Sarah gasped as the bond settled into place, weaving through her chest like roots taking hold. When she opened her eyes, Paul was staring at her with wonder, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I feel you," he whispered. "Everything. Your strength, your certainty, your love," Sarah finished. "You feel my love." Paul laughed, broken and relieved and more human than she'd ever heard him. "It's terrifying." "Good." Sarah pulled him closer. "Now you know what I've felt every time you looked at me." They stood there in the moonlight, the bond humming between them, learning the shape of this new connection. Not ownership, not loss of self, but two people choosing, over and over, to be stronger together. Tomorrow, they would face the trial. Tonight, they simply belonged to each other. Sarah woke with Paul's emotions bleeding through the bond, steady determination threaded with protective tension. He was already awake, dressed in formal armor, preparing for the trial. She reached out instinctively and felt him turn toward her across the room, drawn by the same invisible thread. "How long have you been up?" she asked. "Hours." Paul crossed to the bed, sitting on the edge. "I kept watching you sleep, feeling your dreams through the bond, marveling that this is real." Sarah sat up, the reality of what they'd done settling over her. The bond wasn't overwhelming like she'd feared. It was simply there. A constant awareness of Paul's presence, his emotions, his wolf recognizing hers. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Terrified?" He smiled slightly. "But for the first time, it's not fear of what I might become. It's fear of losing what we've built." Through the bond, Sarah felt the truth of it, and underneath, something else. Pride. Awe. He was marveling at her strength the way she'd always marveled at his restraint. "The trial begins at noon," Paul said. "The council will test the bond's authenticity. There are rituals, questions. They'll try to find cracks, proof that this is political rather than true." "Let them try." Sarah reached for his hand. "They're going to learn the difference between a bond forced by duty and one chosen by love." The council chamber had been transformed. Ancient symbols marked the floor in silver paint, moon phases and pack hierarchies intertwined. Witnesses packed the gallery, courtiers, pack representatives, visiting alphas who'd come to watch the Alpha King prove his fitness to rule. Sarah stood beside Paul at the center of the circle, wearing a simple dress of deep blue that made her look regal without trying. She felt the weight of every gaze, but this time, visibility didn't feel like violence. It felt like power. Lady Marrow stepped forward as the appointed trial keeper. "The trial of true bond is ancient law, designed to distinguish genuine mate recognition from political manipulation." Her voice carried through the chamber. "Alpha King Paul claims this bond was formed by choice, not convenience. Today, we test that claim." "How?" Paul asked, his voice steady despite the tension Sarah felt through the bond. "The bond reveals truth. If genuine, it will show harmony, shared strength, balanced emotions, mutual recognition." Lady Marrow gestured to the circle. "If false, it will show discord, possessiveness without partnership, dominance without trust. The bond cannot lie." Councillor Perth stood, his face tight with barely concealed hope for failure. "We begin with the test of separation. True mates cannot bear prolonged distance without distress. Guards, escort the Omega to the isolation chamber." Sarah felt Paul's wolf surge protectively through the bond, his instinct screaming to refuse. But she squeezed his hand once, sending calm through their connection. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Trust the bond." She let the guards lead her to a small chamber off the main hall, the door closing with finality. Through the bond, she felt Paul's immediate discomfort, not panic, but a persistent wrongness, like a limb gone numb. She sent him steady warmth. I'm here. I'm safe. Breathe. Minutes passed. Sarah felt Paul's tension ease slightly as he realized she wasn't in danger, just separated. The bond hummed between them, uncomfortable but unbroken. When the guards finally retrieved her, Paul's relief flooded through so strongly, she nearly stumbled. The separation test proves nothing, Perth said quickly. Trained alphas can mimic bond behavior. Then we proceed to shared memory, Lady Marrow said. True bonds create bridges. Each mate experiences echoes of the other's significant moments. She looked at Sarah. Tell us something only the bond would reveal. A memory you couldn't have witnessed yourself. Sarah closed her eyes, reaching through the bond. She felt Paul's memories like whispers, and one surfaced clearly. A moment from years ago, before they'd ever spoken properly. You were in the council chamber, Sarah said softly, arguing about the Omega Accords revision. Perth suggested expanding the breeding program to include forced cycles for unmated Omegas. She opened her eyes, looking at Paul. You broke a crystal glass in your hand without realizing. Blood dripped onto the treaty parchment. You were so angry you couldn't speak, because you'd just learned your mother had been subjected to that same program before you were born. The chamber went absolutely silent. Paul stared at her, shock and recognition flooding through the bond. I never told anyone that. The bond did, Lady Marrow said quietly. That memory was witnessed by no one. The broken glass was dismissed as accident. Only you knew the reason. She looked around the chamber. The bond is proven true. Perth's face darkened. One test proves nothing. Then test me, Paul said. He looked at Sarah. Ask me something only the bond would show. Sarah felt his permission through their connection. She reached deeper, finding a memory he'd buried, and understanding flooded through her. You knew who I was before the archives, she said. The first time you really saw me was 3 years ago. I was shelving books in the restricted section. You were hiding from a political delegation. I didn't notice you in the shadows, but you noticed when I started crying. She felt tears prick her own eyes. You heard me whisper that I wished someone would see me as more than what I was born to be. And you made a promise to yourself that day. If you ever had the power to change how Omegas were treated, you would. Paul's breath caught. Through the bond, Sarah felt his overwhelming emotion, that she'd seen his most vulnerable moment, his deepest motivation, and wasn't running from it. The bond is authentic, Lady Marrow announced, witnessed and proven. The crowd erupted, some in approval, others in protest. But Sarah barely heard them. She was watching Paul look at her with something like wonder, realizing that the bond hadn't just proven their connection. It had proven she was strong enough to carry his heart without breaking under the weight. The people began whispering a new title, one not granted by council decree, but earned through presence. Queen. The celebration of the proven bond lasted less than 3 hours. Sarah was in the council antechamber, accepting cautious congratulations from PAC representatives, when Commander Hayes burst through the doors, his face grim. Alpha Damien is back, he said without preamble. With reinforcements. 800 warriors now. They've taken position at the northern ridge and issued a formal challenge. The room went silent. Paul, who'd been speaking with Lady Marrow, went absolutely still. Through the bond, Sarah felt his wolf surge forward, not with fear, but with cold, lethal calculation. A challenge? Paul's voice dropped to that dangerous register Sarah recognized. On what grounds? He's claiming the trial was manipulated, that you've coerced the Omega through forced bonding. Hayes's jaw tightened. He's invoking the right of contest. Trial by combat for leadership of the Stonewolf Dominion. Sarah felt ice flood her veins. The right of contest was ancient law. Any alpha could challenge a king's fitness to rule through single combat. Winner took the crown. And the loser didn't survive. He has council backing, Hayes continued. Perth has been broadcasting claims that you're unstable. Half the northern packs are watching to see if you'll accept. If you refuse, they'll call you weak. If you accept while freshly bonded, they'll claim the bond makes me reckless, Paul finished. Through their connection, Sarah felt him weighing options, calculating odds, planning for scenarios that all ended in violence. When? Paul asked. Sunrise. He's given you until dawn to accept or abdicate. Then I accept. No. Sarah's voice cut through the chamber before she could stop herself. Every eye turned to her. Your Majesty, Hayes said carefully, with respect to the Queen. I'm not Queen yet, but I am bonded to your king, which means I have a voice in this. Sarah crossed to Paul, feeling his surprise through the bond. Damien isn't doing this for honor. This is Perth's plan. Draw you into single combat while you're emotionally heightened from the fresh bond. Make you look unstable regardless of whether you win or lose. If I refuse, I lose the crown anyway. No. Sarah's mind raced, pieces falling into place. If you refuse, you look weak. But if I refuse on your behalf, I look like the controlling influence Perth claims I am. She turned to Hayes. What are the exact terms of the right of contest? Hayes blinked. The challenged party must accept or decline personally. If declined, the crown passes to the challenger by forfeit. And if the challenge is deemed illegitimate, then... Hayes paused. Then it can be dismissed by council vote. But that requires majority support. And with Perth's faction is smaller than it was yesterday, Lady Marrow interjected. She'd been listening quietly, but now stepped forward. The proven bond changed opinions. Several council members who questioned your fitness now see the trial results as validation. How many? Sarah asked. 4 confirmed votes against the challenge. We need 6 for majority. Sarah felt Paul's attention sharpen on her through the bond. He was watching her strategize, seeing her not as someone to protect, but as a partner in this chess game. Then we don't fight Damien, Sarah said. We expose him. Hayes, the correspondence you found between Perth and Blackridge. It proves coordination, doesn't it? Proves this challenge was planned before the trial even concluded. Yes, but circumstantial evidence won't. It will if we make it public. Sarah's voice grew stronger. Call an emergency council session. Before dawn, present the evidence. Force Perth to defend his conspiracy in front of the same witnesses who just watched us prove our bond was true. Paul was staring at her with something like awe through the bond. You want to turn this into a political battle instead of a physical one. I want to win without you having to kill someone to prove a point. Sarah met his eyes. Damien is a symptom. Perth is the disease. Cut off the head, and the challenge collapses. And if the council doesn't vote in our favor, Paul asked, then you fight at dawn. But at least we'll have tried diplomacy first. Sarah felt her wolf rise to meet his through the bond. You've spent 12 years proving you're more than just violence. Don't let Perth force you back into that box. Through their connection, Sarah felt Paul's internal struggle, the instinct to meet challenge with dominance warring against the trust, to let her lead this fight her way. Finally, he nodded. Call the session. The council convened at midnight, furious at the irregular timing, but unable to refuse. Sarah stood beside Paul as Hayes presented the evidence. Letters, payment records, testimony from captured conspirators. Perth's defense crumbled under scrutiny. When Lady Marrow called for the vote, Sarah held her breath. All in favor of declaring Alpha Damien's challenge illegitimate and born of conspiracy. 6 hands rose, then 7, then 8. Majority achieved. "The challenge is dismissed," Lady Marrow announced. "Alpha Damien will be informed that his right of contest is denied on grounds of council manipulation. Any further aggression will be considered an act of war against the Dominion." Through the bond, Sarah felt Paul's fierce pride mixing with relief. He caught her hand, squeezed once. "You just saved my kingdom without a single drop of blood," he sent through their connection. "Our kingdom," Sarah corrected. "And I learned from the best. Sometimes restraint is the most powerful weapon we have." By dawn, Damien had retreated. The war was won before it began. And Sarah realized she'd finally stepped into the role she'd been building toward all along. Not as the Alpha King's weakness, but as his greatest strength. The council restructuring took 3 weeks. Sarah spent them learning what it meant to be not just bonded, but publicly recognized as Paul's partner in ruling. The title Queen had started as whispers. But it grew, pack representatives using it naturally, courtiers bowing with genuine respect rather than obligation, Omegas from across the Dominion sending letters asking if the rumors were true. Had one of their own really changed everything? Now, as Sarah stood in the grand hall, watching Paul address the assembled council, newly reformed, with Perth's conspirators removed and loyalists elevated, she understood the weight of what they'd accomplished. "The Omega Accords are hereby dissolved," Paul announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "No Omega will be held in council trust. No Omega will be distributed as political currency. Their choices are their own, protected by law." The declaration sent ripples through the hall. Some pack alphas looked relieved. Others looked uncertain. Their power structures built on traditions now crumbling. Lady Marrow stood, her elderly face showing approval. "And what of mate selection, Your Majesty? The Council has historically overseen alpha bonding for political stability. The Council may advise. They may not compel." Paul's eyes swept the room. Political alliances matter, but they will be built through trade, through treaties, through mutual respect, not through forced bonds and distributed mates. We've seen where that path leads. Conspiracy, assassination, civil war narrowly avoided. "Some will resist these changes," one of the Northern Alphas said carefully. "Tradition runs deep. Then tradition will adapt." Paul's tone left no room for argument, or it will be replaced by those willing to evolve. Sarah felt his determination through the bond, and underneath, gratitude that she stood beside him for this, that he wasn't dismantling centuries of law alone. "There's one more matter," Paul continued. He turned, extending his hand to Sarah. "The position of Queen has been vacant for 12 years. Today, that changes." Sarah's heart stuttered as she took his hand, stepping forward to join him at the center of the hall. Sarah has proven herself through the trial of true bond. She has demonstrated strategic thinking that prevented war. She has shown strength without cruelty, wisdom without arrogance. Paul's voice softened slightly. "She has also shown me that power shared is power multiplied." He turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. "I don't offer you this crown because you're my mate," Paul said. "I offer it because you've earned the right to help shape this kingdom's future. Because your voice deserves to be heard, not as echo of mine, but as equal to mine." Through the bond, Sarah felt his sincerity and his vulnerability. This wasn't just political ceremony. This was Paul genuinely offering to share power he'd held alone for 12 years. "The choice is yours," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "As it always has been." Sarah looked out at the assembled council, at the pack representatives watching with varying degrees of skepticism and hope, at the kingdom that had spent centuries treating Omegas as lesser. She could refuse, could stay as she was, bonded but separate, influential but unofficial. safe in the shadows she'd spent her life perfecting. Or she could step fully into the light. "I accept," Sarah said clearly, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. "Not just the crown, but the responsibility it represents. To be voice for those who've gone unheard, to help build a kingdom where strength is measured by choice, not domination." Paul's relief flooded through the bond as he lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture of respect, not possession. Lady Marrow approached with a circlet of silver and moonstone, simpler than Paul's formal crown, but no less significant. "By the power vested in this council, we recognize Sarah as Queen of the Stonewolf Dominion, partner in rule, voice in law, equal in authority." As the circlet settled onto Sarah's head, she felt the weight of it, but also the rightness. This wasn't the fantasy she'd imagined in the archives. This was better. Real. Earned. The hall erupted in acknowledgement, not universal approval, but acceptance. The kind that came from witnessing transformation rather than having it forced upon them. That evening, Sarah found Paul on their private balcony, staring out at the kingdom that was now officially theirs to rule together. "Regrets?" he asked as she joined him. "About which part? The bond, the crown, completely upending centuries of tradition?" "Any of it." Sarah leaned into his side, feeling his arm come around her automatically. Through the bond, she felt his contentment, that rare peace he'd been searching for his entire reign. "None," she said honestly, "though I suspect the hard part is just beginning." "Probably." Paul pressed a kiss to her temple. "But at least we face it together." Below them, the Stonewolf Dominion stretched into twilight, a kingdom being reborn through choice rather than force, through partnership rather than domination. Sarah had once feared visibility would destroy her. Instead, it had given her the power to help rebuild a world where no one else would have to hide what they were to survive. "Ready for tomorrow?" Paul asked. Sarah smiled, feeling the bond hum with shared purpose between them. "With you, always." 6 months after the trial of True Bond, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the tower windows and Paul's arm draped across her waist. Through the bond, she felt him surface from sleep, contentment bleeding into awareness, followed by that gentle surge of love that still took her breath away, even after all this time. "You're thinking too loud," Paul murmured against her shoulder. "I'm not thinking anything." "Liar. I can feel you planning something through the bond." He propped himself up on one elbow, silver eyes warm with amusement. "What is it this time? Another council reform? Expanding the Omega education program? Convincing me to attend that treaty dinner with the Western Pax?" "I was actually thinking," Sarah said, turning to face him, "how strange it is that this feels normal now." "Which part? The bond? The crown? Me actually sleeping past dawn?" "All of it." Sarah traced the scar along his collarbone, the one she'd memorized long before she'd had permission to touch it. "A year ago, I was hiding in archives, fantasizing about you from a distance. Now I wake up beside you every morning, help you rule a kingdom, and argue with council members about Omega rights without fear. You do more than argue. You win." Paul caught her hand, pressing it more firmly against his chest. 3 new education centers established. Forced bond legislation banned in 4 allied pacts. Yesterday, I received a letter from an Omega in the Riverlands, thanking you for showing her that wanting something beyond what she was born into wasn't weakness. Through the bond, Sarah felt his pride. Not possessive, but genuine admiration for who she'd become. "That was never just me," she said. "You made space for it. You could have kept power to yourself, could have made me queen in title only. Instead, I discovered that sharing power with someone I trust doesn't make me weak. It makes me better." Paul's thumb brushed across her knuckles. You were right that first night. Restraint wasn't what made me good. Choice was. And choosing to trust you, with everything I'd been holding alone. Best decision I ever made. A knock interrupted them, gentle but insistent. Your Majesties, Commander Hayes called through the door. The morning council session begins in an hour, and the delegation from Silverpine has arrived early. They're asking specifically for the Queen. Sarah felt Paul's amusement through the bond. They always ask for you now. I'm becoming the less popular monarch. Poor Alpha King, overshadowed by his Omega Queen. Sarah kissed him quickly before sliding out of bed. However will your ego survive? Barely. But through the bond, she felt his satisfaction, that the kingdom had learned to value voices beyond just dominant alphas, that change was actually taking root. The council session was routine. Trade agreements, border disputes, the mundane work of actually governing. Sarah found herself contributing naturally now. Her suggestions met with respect rather than skepticism. Afterward, she met with 3 young Omegas who'd traveled from distant packs to see if the rumors were true. They sat in what had once been a cold reception hall, but Sarah had transformed into a warm meeting space. Comfortable chairs, natural light, books lining the walls. Is it real? One of them asked shyly. That you chose him? That the bond didn't force you? It's real, Sarah said. The bond recognized what was already there. Trust, respect, love. But it didn't create those things. We did, through choice. And he listens to you. Actually values your voice. Sarah thought about every council session where Paul had deferred to her judgment. Every late-night strategy conversation where he'd asked her opinion. Every moment he'd chosen partnership over pride. He does, she said. Not because the bond compels him, but because he understands that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about standing together with someone who makes you better. The young Omegas left with something Sarah recognized in their eyes. Hope. The same hope she'd carried in secret for so many years, now finally given space to breathe. That evening, Sarah found Paul in their private study, reviewing reports. She settled beside him, and he automatically shifted to make room, pulling her against his side. Productive day? He asked. 3 more packs are considering Omega education reforms. The Silverpine delegation wants to establish a trade agreement that includes protection clauses for unbonded Omegas. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. We're actually changing things, Paul. You're changing things. I'm just trying to keep up. Through the bond, Sarah felt his honesty, and underneath, that deep contentment that came from finally becoming the king he'd always wanted to be. Not isolated and controlled, but connected and human. Do you remember what you said that first night? Sarah asked. That you didn't know how to love without breaking things. I remember. You were wrong. She tilted her face up to meet his eyes. You didn't break anything. You built something better than either of us could have created alone. Paul's hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone with that devastating gentleness. You taught me that. You taught me the difference between control and connection, between restraint and trust. And you taught me that fantasies can become real, just not in the ways we imagine. Sarah smiled. Better, deeper, more complicated and infinitely more worth it. Paul kissed her then, slow and thorough and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. Outside, the moon rose over the Stone Wolf Dominion, a kingdom being rebuilt through choice rather than force, through love rather than law. Sarah had once feared her fantasy would destroy her. Instead, it had taught an Alpha King how to be human, and in learning to love without fear, they'd shown an entire kingdom that the strongest bonds were the ones freely chosen. Paul ruled the kingdom, but Sarah ruled the part of him he'd never let anyone see, the part that chose gentleness over dominance, partnership over possession, love over power. And in the end, that choice changed everything. The end. They said the Alpha King feared nothing, but he learned to fear losing her, and in that fear found the courage to become something more than just a king. He became hers, and she became the queen who showed a kingdom that strength and choice could exist together. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below. Your support shapes what I create next. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales, where restraint becomes power, and love is always a choice worth making.